Folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today we're going to talk about the plausibility of nuclear war in the context of events that have transpired in the last 48 hours, and it's not looking good. Now, I understand there's a lot of people straddling that fence who are not really sold on this notion that I need to prepare for nuclear Armageddon. And I get it. It's a surreal concept that has up until now only existed in the realm of fantasy and sci-fi fiction. I totally understand, but there's a fundamental belief, a fundamental error that a lot of people make when they're assessing the situation. There's two fundamental errors. One is that nuclear war is going to come about intentionally and that it's not going to happen by accident, which is almost more likely, especially as we start to straddle that red line with the Ruskies as we are doing. And the other is that the global elites of the world are just too smart. They would never let anything like that happen. Now, indeed, as individuals, these global elites of the world would never want to compromise the positions that modern civilization has afforded them. Because think about it. If we go Mad Max, what's the difference between me and Bill Gates? Well, the difference is how fast we can run, how good we are at wielding a firearm, and how much food we have stockpiled and the means to protect it. The difference between me and Bill Gates right now is a whole lot of zeros and a whole lot of commas that depends on this banking system, which is erected on the whole edifice of all the critical infrastructure systems that make that possible. Okay, so without modern civilization, the difference between me and Bill isn't that much. Bill doesn't want that. Bill wants to retain as much privilege as he possibly can. So as individuals, the high-ranking politicians of the world, the CEOs of major corporations, the media moguls, the tech moguls, the high-ranking military officials, all of the high-profile people, they're very intellectually sound, for the most part. You can crack jokes and this and that, but they didn't get there by being stupid, okay? But as a collective, indeed, just like anybody from the bottom rung of the social ladder, these people are very, very stupid. Case in point, if you were trying to rule the world, do you think that you would have as your poster child one of the most nefarious looking people that our imagination can conjure up? And you would call it the World Economic Forum, you'd give it the guy a Swiss accent, you'd make him release all of these ominous videos about these tragic poly-crises that are just coming down the road and what we have to do and all the sacrifices we have to make. That is what you would do if you weren't that intelligent. So that makes me think that as a collective, the rich and the ultra-wealthy of the world, they're flying by the seat of their pants. They really don't have a big master plan. See, a lot of people take solace in this idea that there's this shadowy cabal of people that are just playing with us. But at the very last minute, they're going to pull back and, you know, this is all just an elaborate ploy to mine us for gold and carbon taxes and all the rest. But unfortunately, guys, I regret to inform you that these people as a collective are probably not as smart as you think. Another case in point, check this out. Escort agencies booked solid for the Davos Forum. You see, if they didn't lock up Tate, the top G, they could have just conscripted him. He could have probably hooked him up, I'm sure, but instead they're going with the escort agencies. So these guys masquerading as these moral, authoritative forces in the world and how they're going to do all these things for the betterment of humanity. Clearly, everybody knows it's BS. Both the left and the right are starting to become very critical of these organizations, which is why I think they almost put it there as intentionally. They almost make it as ominous as it appears intentionally to draw our attention. And maybe the other hand is doing something else. Maybe these guys aren't the people who are really in charge after all. But if they are, then we're pretty screwed, because these are the guys that are saying, you know what, we got to push the Ruskies to the point of collapse, to the point where they suffer an existential crisis that might get them to actually push the button. Again, I don't think they want this to happen, but, you know, if you, depending on what tinfoil websites you grace, and I don't encourage you to do so, you might come to that conclusion. But it's really just a matter of incompetence. And the thing is that right now their financial interests are moving them in the direction to engage in this conflict with Russia, because it's all about propping up the phony baloney fiat system that everybody is invested in. These guys, ones and zeros in the bank, a lot of that is petrodollars. Okay, I'm sure some of it's been converted into Swiss francs or whatever they use in Switzerland, or gold. I'm sure if they're smart, they've got a lot of gold. But, you know, a lot of them rely on the US dollar petro complex. So if that were to ever go away, they stand to lose a lot of money. Okay, the people at the top are going to fall the hardest, and they stand to lose the most. Yes, we all stand to lose a job. They stand to lose billions, possibly trillions of dollars if the thing goes belly up and the US is dethroned as a global reserve currency because some other gold-based backed cryptocurrency, BRICS thing, whatever emerges, who knows, comes along. So this is why they are willing to push Putin to the limit, okay? And I'm not saying Putin is not a bad guy. I'm not saying that Putin is innocent in all this. The Chinese and the Russians have their own share of problems, and I'm no fanboy of authoritarianism. I love my freedom or democracy or whatever we have remaining of it. But I'm just saying that you got to be careful because these things can happen accidentally. Now, as we continue to overstep Russia's red lines by sending more and more heavy equipment, by getting closer and closer to the problem, by this slow creep, mission creep encroachment by NATO into the front, aka Ukraine, then the greater the likelihood for a nuclear accident. And by nuclear accident, I mean both sides misreading the other side. So recall that last year, many people have forgotten this already, but the United States had altered its nuclear doctrine. They changed it so that it would allow them to do what's called a preemptive strike if they thought that the situation required it. Now, this really doesn't matter anyways, and this is purely for public consumption, I've always thought, because even the Russians' response to this was, well, maybe we'll do it too. You know, they didn't get all up in arms, and there wasn't this huge display. I mean, obviously, throughout the course of 2022, they have done a lot of saber rattling when it comes to nuclear weapons. But after the United States made this announcement, it wasn't a huge deal for the Russians. And that just shows me that a lot of these nuclear doctrines, as they're written by both the Russians and the Americans, are purely for public consumption to bring us a false sense of confidence that our government would never be the ones who initiated a nuclear war. Fact is, now it's codified in the nuclear doctrine, okay? So now the United States can, if they want, do a preemptive nuclear strike out in public. Did the public care about this at all? No, we didn't care about this at all. I'm not sure if that was during Amber Heard or if that was post Amber Heard. I'm sure something else was going on that was more important, probably something with Biden or Trump. But fact of the matter is, our nuclear doctrine now allows us to do a preemptive nuclear strike. And what that means, now that the Russians know that that's our official policy, there's a greater likelihood that they might misinterpret some signals coming from us and they might overreact, because now that there's a risk of a preemptive strike, they have a smaller and smaller window to react, because of course there's all those nuclear missile systems in NATO that are just minutes away from Moscow. This is why Putin's in the bunker when he's doing these things. It's not just for show, it's because at any given time the bombs can start flying. And he probably really believes this if he's smart. And it's probably more to do with it happening accidentally, because we might think that they're shooting something and they're not. And now that we're in the age of AI, cyber attack, we could be tricked into starting a nuclear war with one another by some bad actor who wants to get rid of both America and Russia. Most people don't think about that. I believe that Elon Musk talked about this with AI as being something which could potentially trigger a nuclear war, okay, between two superpowers. Just like the whole Skynet philosophy, you get Russia and the United States to think that each other is attacking, so they take each other out. Skynet goes in there and cleans house. That sort of thing, minus the Skynet, because of course it would be another country or bad actor involved. But the thing to understand is that nuclear war is likely to happen by accident if it happens at all, especially now that Russia is releasing this new generation of nuclear weapons. This is why the U.S. changed its official nuclear posture. Emphasis on official, because DEFCON is confidential. I'm pretty sure that their true nuclear doctrine, if they knew that the Russians were going to launch some sort of nuclear offensive, they would do a preemptive strike regardless of the nuclear doctrine. But now that Russia is coming out with all this new technology, like something that they're just getting ready to unveil, which is these unstoppable nuclear torpedoes that will devastate cities with radioactive tsunamis, this means that the risk of a preemptive strike from our side is much, much higher. And that means that the Russians are going to be looking for signals of a preemptive strike. Now, if this war that we're in right now goes to space or goes to the cyber level, where some of our alert systems get blinded or compromised, maybe we lose information that would alert us that there was a nuclear strike inbound. Maybe the Russians take out a satellite. They showed us a year ago, back in November, before this war started, that they could do that very thing. If that happens, then the likelihood of an accidental retaliatory strike is higher, even though we may have not initiated a preemptive strike. Now, because you have Russia now gaining the strategic advantage with these variety of systems that they have an advantage in electromagnetic pulse weapons, in hypersonic weapons that are launched from airplanes, from the ground, from a warship. They have an advantage in terms of these nuclear torpedoes that are nuclear powered. Okay, so nuclear powered 100 megaton nuclear torpedoes shot from a nuclear powered K-class submarine, which is a very large submarine, the Belgorod. I think it's one of the biggest submarines in the world. It is currently out to sea. They're currently stocking it with these 100 megaton, potentially 100 megaton nuclear weapons that can generate tsunamis that would just annihilate the entire East Coast. So never mind that 100 megaton only being used to take out one state. Try all of the eastern coastal cities. We're talking about 1,000 meter wave, okay, that was generated by detonating one of these off the coast, and it's undetectable. It can't be beat. It can travel 6,500 miles, and it can do it fast at 100 kilometers an hour. You cannot find this thing or defeat it in any way. This gives the Russians a strategic advantage. This puts the United States on edge because they now don't know, now that this thing is out there, it changes the game. Never mind the RS-28 Sarmat, which has the capability to deliver 50 megatons. Okay, that's their new ICBM that can circumnavigate via the South Pole, where you're not going to expect it because all of our alert and missile detection is based in the north, and I'm sure that our missile defense is tuned towards missiles coming inbound over Canada, so they can do it any way they want now because these missiles have a longer range. They travel incredibly fast, just like all ICBMs, 20,000 miles an hour, so incredibly fast, impossible to defeat. And they have multiple re-entry vehicles, which are navigable, and I mean, it's just impossible to intercept this stuff, okay? And they can shoot decoys, so every missile can have up to 50, 40 decoys and 10 actual live nuclear warheads, each with like 5 megatons of, so I mean, it's unstoppable stuff. So what this does, in addition to all of the other technology that they have, I think there's a few more that I'm forgetting about. There's one called Skyfall, and I think that one is still in the prototype phase, but it's a nuclear-powered plane that just flies around nonstop, and it's armed with a nuke, and it can just, target anywhere. So it's like the next generation of bomber of that leg of the nuclear triad. And God only knows what they have in space. God only knows what we have in space. I'm sure we have some stuff that's classified. A lot of people like to hang on this idea that, oh, well, the United States actually has secret weapons that they're not disclosing. Well, the whole point of a strategic arsenal is to put the adversary on notice that you have that thing and that you should not use your nukes or else this is what you're going to get. strategic ambiguity doesn't come into play when we're talking about strategic arsenals, actual nuclear weapons. No, if we had more advanced hypersonic weapons, we would be putting them on display to discourage the Russians, and maybe that would be changing the whole balance of power with the current Ukraine situation. As much as I sympathize with the Ukrainians who are fighting on the ground for their freedom, I'm not going to get into all the nuance of all this. I know just because I said that, I'm going to create a debate in the comment section. Just stay focused on the nuclear war stuff, okay? As much as I sympathize with what people have going on there, the fact of the matter is, if the Russians lose, this is an existential threat to them, and then the risk of a nuclear accident intensifies a lot. It increases a lot. Now, right now, the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back out of Bakhmut, it does appear. And that's by the Ukrainians' own admission. There are rumblings that the situation is difficult and they may have to do a strategic pullout, as it's called. So right now, that might appease the Russians, that they're not feeling so backed up against the wall, and that might actually allow tensions to kind of simmer down on the strategic front a little bit. But because of the commitment by NATO to intervene in this conflict, with more weapons being committed, and even the Polish premier going so far to say that if Ukraine loses, then that's going to lead to World War III, which is actually kind of backwards from my perspective. This just means that this war is not going to come to an end anytime soon. Because if Ukraine wins, that's when the risk for nuclear war is actually highest. If Ukraine loses to the Russians, while that might beget another conflict down the road, in the short term, anyways, it diminishes the chance that the Russians are going to feel the need to utilize nuclear weapons. In the long term, however, he may be right, because of course that inevitably is going to involve some sort of confrontation between Russia with the rest of Europe. And unfortunately, right now, Ukraine is being utilized as a proxy. They are the front, which is quite appropriate because Ukraine, the word Ukraine means the borderland, the frontier. So this was almost written in the stars, it seems, this conflict, where you have East versus West and the battleground being the borderland. So right now, the NATO is getting ready to send all this heavy equipment, tanks, and that's just the beginning, because it's another red line that's been crossed, increasing the likelihood of a nuclear accident. Okay, now one thing that, let me just see if I can find my notes here. So Viktor Medvedchuk, he was a former Ukrainian oligarch who was very pro-Russian. I believe he was somewhere in the Donbass. He was probably going to be in charge of one of these annexed territories, but they captured him. They did a POW swap. He's basically come out today and said there's only two ways out of this conflict: to slide into a world war and a nuclear conflict, or to start the process of détente again, for which it is necessary to take into account the interests of all parties. Do you guys think this is going to happen when you have people at the World Economic Forum who are so concerned about preserving this monetary system that basically has afforded them all of their privilege? They're not going to want to give that up gently. And I've always said that this is an existential war for the West, because if Russia wins, okay, not only do they conquer the territory, but it's the beginning of the end for NATO, the US dollar as a reserve currency. It's the beginning of the multipolar world where people will not have to just put their money in USD if they want to trade. And that is the biggest nightmare for all the elites who bank on the system. Now, I have US dollars in my bank account, as I'm sure a lot of you do as well. So I'm not saying this from a perspective of, yeah, I hope the Russians, defeat, the Ukrainians and NATO loses and the US dollar collapses, because that wouldn't be good for me too, like pragmatically speaking. Hopefully there is some way that we can have a bit of both, and that it's a soft pullback of both our current fiat petrodollar system and our military forces, and the rise of the inevitable rise of China, Russia, and the rest of the world for that matter. We can find a way to coexist. Hopefully that's what happens, but it's looking as though that the people at the top are dumb enough to push us close enough to the brink that an accident is going to happen. Again, individually, these people are smart. I don't think any of them, if asked, would be an advocate for nuclear war just so they could live out the rest of their life in their bunker, no matter how lavish the Optimum bunker that is accommodating them. I do, however, think that they're going to act on self-interest and they're going to inform one another. And there's this thing called groupthink where everybody is getting false information, circulating false information, and reinforcing a misperception of the current military situation to the point where things spiral out of control. And that's very well what could happen.